This week, the second season of the A Bintel Brief podcast, a revival of the classic advice column from The Forward, is upon us. So I talk with hosts Ginna and Lynn and Chana, The Forward's archivist, about the importance of Jewish advice, the history of A Bintel Brief, and, bear with me, sex, party, rabbi. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. This podcast is supported by the Newman School at the Talmud Torah of St. Paul, where academic excellence and Jewish values meet, teaching analytical and critical thinking skills that are necessary to thrive in a complex world, now enrolling grades K through 5. Learn more at ttsp.org/Newman. If you like this podcast or Jewfolk generally and the work that we do, support us by buying our merch. We've got designs for everything. If you're feeling proud, pick up a 10,000 Ways to be Jewish shirt. Feeling grab a 10,000 Ways to Disappoint Your Parents mug. And when you're feeling totally done, which seems to happen a lot nowadays, grab a shirt that reads, "The Jews are tired, stop tweeting like now." A link to the store is in the podcast notes, so go take a look, and there's also a link to donate to Jewfolk in the podcast notes if you want to give directly. We appreciate any support you can give. By the way, as of the release of this podcast, it's day 78 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. Okay, some background on A Bintel Brief. A Bintel Brief was the advice column of the Yiddish Daily Forward newspaper from 1906 until the mid-1980s, offering wisdom in response to the trials and tribulations of Eastern European Jewish immigrants learning to call this country home. It was started by the Forward's famous founding editor-in-chief Abraham Kahan when he started publishing his responses to letters to the editor that he received, and he picked a catchy but basic name for the column. A Bintel Brief means a bundle of letters in Yiddish. Just to give you a taste of some of what Kahan was responding to, A Bintel Brief dealt with everything from how to unionize your workplace and stop your boss bullying you, to whether or not an American-born Jewish woman should leave her fresh-off-the-boat fiancé because her friends look down on him for being a new immigrant and seeming backwards. There's a link in the podcast notes to a PDF that has some of the stories from A Bintel Brief translated into English in case anyone was worried about that, but I'd highly recommend you go check that out. Even if you don't, stick around and you'll get to hear a lot more about the historic advice column during my conversation with Gina Green, Lynn Harris, and Chana Pollack. Because here's the thing, the Yiddish Bintel Brief might have ended in the 1980s, but the Forward, now operating mostly in English and celebrating its 125th year of existence this year, actually, recently rebooted A Bintel Brief as a podcast. Gina is the podcast's co-host from South Carolina, a strategist consultant at the firm Uprise, who is also on the boards of progressive Jewish groups Bend the Arc and the Jews of Color Initiative. Lynn is the co-host from New York, a writer, activist, and former columnist for Glamour magazine, as well as several other magazines in an advice-bearing capacity. And Chana has been the Forward's archivist for the past 2 decades. By the way, if you think that word should be pronounced archivist or something, I'm sorry. The point is she knows the archive and the history of the Forward. So season 1 of the new Bintel Brief podcast came out last year in the fall, and now season 2 is rolling out. In fact, I'm pretty sure we're on the same bi-weekly Thursday publishing schedule, so episode 1 of season 2 came out 2 weeks ago, and episode 2 of season 2 should be out the same day this episode of The Jews Are Tired drops. So keep an eye out for that. And there is a link in the podcast notes to the A Bintel Brief podcast page where you can start listening. Now, getting to talk to Gina, Lynn, and Chana was a ton of fun. I love it when legendary community stuff is brought back to life. And because I'm both a history and journalism geek, who knew, A Bintel Brief is extra cool to me. And it's really interesting to also connect the dots on where the American Jewish community was at during the first Bintel Brief and where we are now, how we see ourselves and the issues we're focused on today. So that's what I asked the three of them about, along with, getting to know the story behind how Ginna and Lynn became the new advice Jews and how they approached the responsibility of A Bintel Brief. And in the process of all of this, by the way, Chana told us some very cool stories about Bintel Brief and the forward. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds cool and all, but what's up with this sex party, Rabbi? And why is this episode called Sex Party Bintel? Believe me, you'll get there, just like a little bit longer. Last thing I'll say for the intro is that the Forward's new website is linked in the podcast notes, so celebrate 125 years of its journalism by checking that out. And if you want to support the journalists and employees of the Forward, a link to the Twitter account of the Forward's union is also in the podcast notes. Okay, have a blast with this conversation, which has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. Hi, everyone. I'm Lev Gringauz, the host of the Jews Are Tired podcast.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gina Green, and I'm a co-host of A Bintel Brief, the Jewish advice podcast from the Forward.
Hi, I am Lynn Harris. I am Gina's co-host.
And hi, I'm Chana Pollack, and I'm the Forward's archivist.
So let's start someplace I hope will be fun and interesting. What's one of the most intriguing or unexpected requests for advice you've gotten, and why? And for Chana, all of that, but what you've maybe found in the Bintel Brief archives.
Ooh, we've had so many questions that have come through. I still think, Lynn, one of our most interesting questions, and it's not just because I like to talk about sex, but Sex Party Rabbi, which is a question that we didn't actually answer for the podcast. It was our screen test, or what's the audio? It was our audio test to decide, would we become the Bintel co-host? And we got a question from someone who had spotted their rabbi at a sex party. And it's like, that is the last place maybe that I want to see my rabbi. And yet there was something, I was like, okay, the rabbi was at a sex party. So there was a lot to talk about. What do you think?
Yeah, now this is the biggest opposite of spoiler in the world because, fun fact, we didn't answer it on the podcast. So, but right. Obviously we haven't been able to get it out of our minds. Yeah, that was a really good one because I think the person who wrote the question was very thoughtful in the way they posed it.
Yeah. They
didn't just say, horrors, I saw my rabbi at a sex party. How do we get this person fired and shunned? Right? The question was, well, can't unsee that. Now,
so what
how do I
do?
Right. Now, how do I relate to this person as clergy? It's just two images that are hard for me to reconcile. And is that my problem? Kinda. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but
yeah,
do just because it's a new juxtaposition for me, is it wrong? Is it bad? What do I need to reconcile? Or do I just tell the board? So it was, it was a good one.
I want to circle back to that a little bit later in the podcast.
Sure,
so
you do.
Just to set the stage now, I am curious, what answer would you have sort of given to actually address that? Because you said you never had. So just to kind of plant the seed now. But Chana, sorry, you were saying.
I guess I'm going to pivot to the nerdly, wonkish question I fell on last week, which was, and to be clear, I can't really pick a favorite because they just kind of blow my mind all the time. And it's a really, really deep collection of over a century's worth of material. So that said, letting myself off the hook, I read this one a couple of weeks ago that kind of blew my mind because I ended up feeling sorry for everybody involved. Usually when I hear them, I pick right away. I'm so intolerant. I pick a side. But this time I was just I felt bad for everybody and I couldn't let it go. And it was kind of like a classic tale, I'm sure all of us have heard of before, but the way it was written out, it sort of seemed like it could also be like a Sopranos, like a screenplay. It was a young man who had come to America. It was very early. It was in the early 1900s, I think this one was from. He was from poor family, but he really had started to get an education in Eastern Europe, and he wanted to continue that in America. But unfortunately, typically, he landed in New York, and he had to get into the sweatshops to make a living. But along the way, he heard of an opportunity of a woman who was already in her mid-20s and really was desperate to get married.
Whoa.
Anyways, you can probably guess how this turned out. So he was like, she's really wealthy. I really want to study. This working in the sweatshop is breaking my spirit and really killing me. If I do this, she'll like support me studying, right? So they sort of made this deal. Anyways, time goes on a little bit and they're about to have their fancy, engagement party where all parties agree to, whatever the terms were. And he starts having regret and his regret turns to resentment. And he's like, oh, I can't stand her. They went out one night and they went to a lecture. He was like trying her out, right, to his world. So he took her to like a lecture on the Lower East Side, right? That's what people did for fun if you were intellectual back in the day. Anyways, long story short, he did not like her comments after the lecture. He was like, okay, that's it. I'm done. I can't do this fake marriage arrangement thing. I just can't do it. And he walks out on her. And then she has like a very formidable brother. And so now he's terrified he's going to get he's going to get beaten up. So anyways, long story short, he writes to the forward. He's like, I'm terrified, but I'm also desperate. I feel terrible for what I've done. I don't know what to do. Should I just, say I'm sorry and get this fake marriage thing and get my education? Or like, what are my choices here? So, that was one that really kind of...
Wait, what was the answer? What did Abe Kahan say?
Yeah, right?
I really need to know.
The answer was like, fairly simple, we would say today. But I guess in those days it was, there was a lot riding on it, but they were basically like, yeah, this is not going to work out well. Like, don't do it to yourself. Don't imprison yourself in a relationship. It's unfair to her, which I thought was very progressive of them. And it's also really bad for you.
The amazing thing about these letters is the stories that they tell, but also the language in which they're told. And I don't mean literally Yiddish, although yes, of course, also that. The poetry of the writing and the poetry of the responses is something else. It's almost like comparing like letters home from the Civil War to text message, like dearest so-and-so compared to like new phone, who's this? Of the way we speak and write these days. And there's something and that's why that's one of the reasons that they've become so, that they are rightly considered not just history, but also literature.
Yeah, that's amazing. I should also really try and avoid my parents listening to this podcast or else they might get some ideas from that because I am still single at 24. But anyway.
Spinster, Lev. That's what
And this is your shop.
Terrible.
You're in the podcast sweatshop.
Exactly. So I'm curious also because, doing an advice column or podcast is also a really interesting way to get at some of the primal issues and worries of American Jews today. And I'm wondering if you've developed any kind of thesis about where American Jews are at and the kind of advice you give them. Like the original Bintel Brief over 100 years ago is all about Jews, becoming American and the effort to help them do so. And Chana obviously step in and correct me or elaborate on this if I'm kind of off course. But now that 100 some years later that we are basically American as a community, what's the thesis that the Bintel Brief is operating under for where we're at and the advice that you're giving?
I think I know Ginna can elaborate on this, but I surely Chana, but I think the presumption now is one of extraordinary diversity, that there is not one thing that you can't say just one thing and have it be true of all American Jews. That, right. And it's not like the community wasn't diverse before. It's that we have an understanding now of its diversity and a participation in the cultures plural that wasn't possible to be realized 100 years ago.
I think that's so true. And even though, we have always been a diverse community, but it is still also true that just as it's still true now that we are still a mostly white Jewish community in North America, back then, we were exceedingly Yiddish speaking at the turn of the century as a community. These are still facts and they're still true. And so I think Lynn is 100% on point. I think one of the things that has come through over the questions over the first season and the beginning of our second season this spring is that we are still concerned. We will never stop being concerned with identity and with Israel. Which makes sense But those, I believe, will be central questions forever.
Yeah, I think just to a little bit of historical context that surprises me because, from what I'm hearing and what we're doing and creating now, and also from 125 years ago, or in 1906, so a little less than 125 years ago when they started the Bintel Brief. I think the mandate, we could say that there is one, is really to be what we still want the forward to be today, which is like a site for civil discourse on any topic. And interestingly, like if you listen to the examples, right, we just brought, whether it's the rabbi in the sex party or the young man trying to get his education, but getting a fake engagement, all that kind of stuff. It's also about being able to be public with your stuff. Like, right, there's that saying, you're only as sick as your secrets. So it's a way. It's kind of really interesting because it's true that back in the day, media, as we call it today, like a newspaper, right, had a real profound effect on the public conversation, yes. But there was also this kind of weird sort of wall where people may not have realized so much that if they were going to write a letter to the Bintel Brief, and granted they were writing anonymously, so they did have some sense that it was going to be public, right? They knew everyone who knew them was going to be reading it. And yet there was still this intense desire for a public conversation on their issue, right? Which is why they did it. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, I think we started the platform of, how to build civic discourse and civil civic discourse on a wide array of topics.
Right. Not just news, but people's everyday lives.
Right.
At the same time.
Yeah. Because some of the idea that Abkan expressed about how he got to, inventing the Bintel Brief or thinking of it for the Yiddish speaking community was actually because he was a writer. He, at that, by the time of 1906, by the time he was doing the Bintel Brief, he had already published a couple of novels, many short stories in English and Yiddish. And he was a deep believer that life, what do we say? Fact is stranger than fiction, right? That real people's lives had the workings of fiction was so clear to him, bound up in the lives of the people who came to that, forward office and told their stories or wrote their letters in or had their letters written for them, right?
Right. So. And Chana, you've mentioned many times before that people, like you just said, weren't just writing to the forward. They were coming to the headquarters and talking about their questions and leaving them there and being a place for community and discourse, not just in print, but even in life. And I think that connection is so strong and so clear.
Sounds like the forward needs to open up a JCC to have sort of the same environment. You can do a live recording of the Bintel Brief as people come up to you.
Ooh.
Is it right? Your free idea. I do kind of want to take a step back for a little bit because, the Bintel Brief and its kind of legendary origin is so wrapped around Abe Kahan. And now it's in your hands, Ginna and Lynn. So I would love to take a step back and ask, how did you two become the advice Jews? Did the forward call you up? Were you ever worried about taking on the responsibility of the Bintel Brief and like the pressures of giving good advice? How did this kind of work out?
There was a national open call for the adviciest Jews. No, it's really just not even that interesting a story, unfortunately. I mean, my boring answer is simply that I know Jody. She knows me.
And Jody is the editor-in-chief of the Forward.
Correct. Jody Radoran. I knew her already personally and professionally. I spent many years as a journalist and also as an advice columnist for my own work as under the guise of the superhero character Breakup Girl, and also for many, many magazines and newspapers of blessed memory. And so I think that it just seemed to Jody that I was someone who at least could be or should be in the mix of the folks to be considered for the gig. And I do, this is common, but not across the board. I do have, I feel a connection through my Ashkenazi forebears who did come who were Yiddish speaking immigrants who did come and did come here and my grandfather was a tailor and like all that stuff. It's me. So I certainly feel that connection as well. So there were just conversations and as Ginna said, some screen testing and practice involving Sex Party Rabbi. And here we are. For me, that's for me.
That's for Lynn. And so apparently the legend goes that there were some people before me, Lynn, who were sort of in the mix and potential partners, I believe. They didn't work out. They weren't the adviceiest Jews, like Lynn said, I guess. But Jody reached out to me. I also had developed a relationship with Jody before this process, and she'd reached out to me and said, I think we've got one of our co-hosts. We're still looking for the other one. And that's when I came into the mix, and Lynn and I talked about Sex Party Rabbi together and
haven't stopped.
And the rest is history. And I will also say that, I think a lot about the fact that Bintel is now in the hands of two women, of a Black woman from the South too. Like, I think a lot about the fact that there was probably no way that Abe Khan could have imagined this podcast and these two particular people being the ones who were dishing out audio advice to the Jews. I mean, maybe.
Too many devices in people's pockets.
Right? Like, that just seems so wild to me. And it feels, particularly for me, like such an opportunity to be a reflection of that modern diversity that Lynn mentioned earlier, right? That reflection of the community that we have always been and have just becoming more and more and more of that over the years and decades. You were going to say something, Chana, weren't you?
There was, in the 1920s, at some point, the Forward experimented for one of its first times with an English supplement. And there was there was like a sidebar, like an English advice column is what I'm trying to say. And it was called Ask Polly. And to this day, I'm not 100% sure if this individual was created or if she was an actual person. But her backstory is that she was actually a social worker on the Lower East Side, Polly Lerner. And they did pull her in to be an advice columnist. So,
we learned something today. Chana has never shared that with us. So wait, how long did Ask Polly run?
Well, that insert was like just under a decade, like kind of the roaring 20s. The Forward had like a roaring English supplement that came out on Sundays. And I'm going to give her 5 years, but within a decade, somewhere, 5, 6 years.
That's a while.
Yeah, that's a good little run. Okay.
Yeah. It was a lot. It was like a heavy time. I remember seeing questions about young Jewish women wanting to go to college. That was an issue. And once they were in college, the issue became young Jewish women dating non-Jewish men. You can see the trajectory.
I take it back. I take it back. Abe might have been able to imagine some women, but maybe not a Black woman. How about that? I do not think Abe would have imagined that for sure. And certainly not computers in our pockets.
Right.
Definitely.
Well, okay, there was one other woman, Rose Pastor Stokes, and this is a turn of this, before this Polly Lerner, there's Rose Pastor Stokes, was very short, and she was a super intense activist on the Lower East Side. So not a woman of color, but a, stand-up activist, suffragist, birth control, poverty, justice, total social justice person. And she had a terrible breakup. She was married to like a very, very well-known WASP individual. She came from a very poor Jewish family on the Lower East Side. Anyways, I think during her terrible post-marriage divorce, Khan gave her like a gig and was like, you can do the Bintel for a little bit.
Wow. So Chana is giving the Jews are tired. Right. Chana is giving Jews are tired, like all the tea from the turn of the century, which is amazing. And also, of course, at that point in time, if anybody was thinking about elevating women to positions of visibility, it was going to be probably Black folks and Jews, right? So not surprised, actually, that we had a little bit of that percolating back then.
Am surprised we're still fighting for birth control. Yeah.
It's amazing and terrible how the same issues are still ever present.
Yep.
Also, for listeners, I believe it was the 1920s, Chana, correct me if I'm wrong, when the Forward had more subscribers than the New York Times at that point. There was like a decade period in there, right?
Yes. You could see the rise actually in like from 1910, around there, they hit 100,000. That's like huge. Like at this point, they're like actually supporting themselves by subscriptions, and they're busting out their advertising. Like it's starting to become attractive to advertise in the Forward. And then by the mid 20s is when most people kind of say we hit 250,000, like 250,000, and we were outpaced the New York Times. Yeah.
I just love that context for listeners of like how big the Forward and Yiddish as a language and sort of all of that was during that time period. But I also want to ask, to sort of bring it back to A Bintel Brief specifically, I also want to ask kind of an obvious question. What's the value of a Jewish advice column? And Chana, you kind of gave a little bit of the sort of historical element, but it'd be cool if you could kind of get into a little bit more of why, like for readers, it was such a big deal that this existed, not just for the people kind of sending in stuff. And then for Ginna and Lynn also, same kind of question. How do you see your roles now in serving the community with the Bintel Brief? What's so, great about a Jewish advice podcast?
I'll take a first crack and just quickly say that I think that there is something about the Jewish experience and Jewish identity that is like a lens or a layer on life and the lived experience. And there is something about asking a question that's about the workplace or that is about relationships, but that has that nuance of Jewish like life and language and approach that I do think is part of being Jew, like of being Jewish, of being a Jew, of being in the community. There are elements of just culture and lived experience that I think sort of live beneath and through all of the ways that we experience life.
To build on what Gina's saying, it's a truism. We know this about Judaism, that it's not about how we live our life in the synagogue. It's how we live our life. So, and that's why there's a tradition of asking the rabbi what to do about the thing, or asking the rebbitzin what to do about the thing. And it's part of our tradition, asking what's my rove? What's my move? And combine that with the fact that we're actually interpreting text. We love to do close readings of what people say, why they chose a word, what aren't they saying. One of our favorite letters was from someone who we read the whole thing and dug into it. And then we went, and then Gina was like, wait a minute, he never actually asked a question. So, and then we got to explore, well, what is he then? Okay, he didn't ask a question. What does he want? Then does he want just us to reflect back to him? Does he want affirmation? Does he want reassurance? So we got to dig into that, so it's the combination of what's my move in daily life? What's the right thing to do? And getting those answers out of textual analysis, which I think are both just super Jewish-y things to do.
The episode you're referencing was with the guy who's in his 50s, who's concerned about being single and the family.
Not Dad.
Mr. Not Dad, who wants a family. Right. Yeah, that's another favorite that we actually did answer.
We did answer that one.
We told him to go to sex parties, which is weird. JK.
Lynn, and I don't think I mentioned this to you, but I had 2 separate, also Mr. Not Dads, text and or email me and say, thank you for that episode. I'm in a similar position as Mr. Not Dad, and thank you. So it resonates too, Lev, too, right? Like,
It reminds me of a word you used earlier, Lev, which is the word primal. And I think that's one of the reasons that people just love advice columns and hearing other people's stuff, because there's always, with the best letters and the best questions, which are the best stories, the reason why they resonate is that they have the perfect balance of very specific to that person, the details, the setting, the characters, whatever it is, but they always ask about and speak to something primal. connection with family, community, fear, belonging, whatever it is, there's always something primal. So they're always interesting as stories, but relatable as at their emotional core.
And Chana, it would be great to, again, kind of fill in the historical, because the thing that I'm kind of also interested in on this specific aspect is, for A Bintel Brief, there's obviously the focus on the turn of the century, early 20th century, the kind of big, early immigrant experience, all the socialist and social justice activism and all that. But A Bintel Brief kept going until like the 70s, right? So can you talk a little bit about, like, that's a long time for people to continue to be invested past the original point of like immigration and activism. So like what, over the long arc, what kept people coming back,
Yeah, I want to just draw like one from Ginna, one from Lynn, like lived life and, the primal nature of it is for sure, right? That the answer is in there. But I also want to say, like, when you look at the paper, and you're totally right, the arc was 1906 until I think 83 or 84 is how long it ran. And, you do have to ask yourself, if you started in 1906 and you ran for a couple of like close to a century, there's going to be some repetition. Let's just we accept, right? But the amazing thing is, like, nobody can really tell. Like, there's nobody out there who's like, I heard that letter, and it just keeps on going. Like, it keeps, people may not read Yiddish, but if you say you read the forward or you say something about the forward, one of the first things they come back at you with is, oh, the Bintel Brief. Like, people, that sort of branded us before anything else. So that's kind of interesting, right? And, and it's not that different from, Dear Abby, right, is the thing we're always compared to. It's like, it was a form of that very primal life lived and just the people's voice and the poetry in the people's voice. So I think that's part of it. But I have to say, when you look at the forward over time, doesn't matter if I dive in the 70s or if I'm looking in the 20s or the 10s, it does kind of beg the question of, like, you do kind of wonder, well, why did he do it? Because it looks like the people are replying to the paper. The paper was so DIY. It was so engaged with the voice. You kind of wonder, like, who is the editor and who is the reader? Like, you're always like, wait. Or, they always made room. Like, if you wrote a letter to the editor and it was just like, I don't know, 50 pages long, you probably got a column out of it. Like, they really took it seriously. That was also part of their mandate. It wasn't just like, we need your subscriptions. It was like, we need you. We need to know what you're thinking. We need to know what you're feeling. And we need to know what you're thinking about us, and what you think about the world, what you think about being Jewish. Like, they really wanted to know, like, what's on the mind of the people, So I think that energy was really authentic. And I think that is, what Ginna and Lynn are calling, live life, and also that primal energy. It's very authentic. And the other thing I think is, like, just basic being Jewish 101 is, like, we are loquacious. Right? When Ginna talks about, like, having a Talmudic kind of feel, when Ginna and Lynn are like, I do sometimes sit there and I'm like, this is more, from and shul going than I have done in like decades. It's like amazing. And it's life. It's just life, right? The rabbi at the sex party is just life in the 21st century. It just is,
Correct.
And I'm sure it was life in the 19th and the 20th. We just maybe didn't talk about it publicly, but I'm sure we talked about it.
Yeah.
The roaring sex parties of the 20s. Yeah.
Hey, why only the 20s? If you're going to be Jewish, have fun the whole time, That's not
Fair.
legal advice for listeners, by the way. That's just got it. So I am going to ask about the sex rabbi. But before finally getting the answer on that, I'm curious, like, when you're putting together your answers and your final advice, how do you mediate between? Because there's got to be times when, like, Lynn and Ginna, you two disagree, and you have to, like, figure out what's the best way to answer something, what's ultimately the best advice. How do you kind of give that? How do you mediate sort of your own views and opinions and the places you come from when it's sort of presenting the final thing as, a Bintel Brief or the Bintel Brief?
We have to write to a whole nother advice column to ask how to resolve our own this is so boring, but, like, we often agree. I think we often, But I think sometimes where we diverge, we joke that that the nickname or the other name of the podcast should be the Go Talk to Them podcast, because that's you really could kind of file all our advice away under that. But we sometimes diverge on tactics and expectations around those conversations that we recommend. What should you say? When should you say it? What should you expect to come out of it? How personal or challenging should you be, et cetera, et cetera. So we tend to diverge in smaller ways, or we also tend to kind of enter questions from different angles, but then kind of wind up in the same place in the middle. So that's a little abstract. But we certainly bring different life experiences, different lenses, different starting points. And one of these days we'll completely disagree.
One of these days, maybe in season 2. But I do think that I agree totally with the fact that we oftentimes agree to the extent that, listeners, we were told by the forward, like, y'all need to disagree some more. They were like, we need to find some moments of tension, because the reality is that it is true. We're coming into the question from different places. But I think the fact that we often do agree is testament in some ways to the fact that we are approaching the problem or approaching this work from a place of, it's not about necessarily the actual advice, but the process that we go through to get there. And so what are the questions that we're asking? Who are the players involved? What are everyone's needs? And I think that because we both have sort of a kind of a strategic approach to giving the best advice that we can, that's why we might start in 2 different places, but that we often end up in the same place, which means that you can really trust our advice.
Gina, I totally disagree. No, you heard it here. Yeah, I think that's honestly, I think that's right.
It's really like a Talmudic almost, of just sort of sorting through the process way more than necessarily getting to the answer, but then arriving at a similar answer through differing means. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked through the process, everything's Talmudic, sex party rabbi, go.
Our first question was, where exactly was this sex party? And no, it.
Right. Can we get an invite?
Right. I think we landed on. I think we very much understood. Correct me, Gina, but I think that there is that we landed in kind of a place where we acknowledged that you could accept and even with no moral judgment that, like, rabbis can go to sex parties in, like, there's a place where you could take away moral judgment and be like, okay, that's a lifestyle choice, and also acknowledge that there is a word for this that I can't think of, forgive me, but there is actually also, though, an expectation that a rabbi, again, there's a literal word for this, that a rabbi will comport themselves in a way that supports their position of leadership. And I'm not rendering that quite right. And so you could make an argument that, especially because of the way the writer framed the question, that, like, I can't unsee this now when I'm in shul, that you could make the argument that going to a sex party where you know you will be seen, whether it's a sex party or some other thing that might be hard for folks to reconcile, you could make the argument judgment call. And I think but we stopped sort of like actually opining on the rabbi, but rather that wasn't the point. The point, the writer, whoever was saying, what should I do? And I think we landed, Gina, on, given those concerns and considerations, you got to talk to them, right? What else do you remember?
You got to talk to the rabbi. I mean, there's really no way around it. I mean, because to the extent that not talking to the rabbi just means that they're building up this anxiety and resentment and discomfort.
Right. And they can't be a congregant. They can't fully
they can't fully be
as a congregant.
A congregant, exactly. They can't fully be free as a congregant without being able to like have that relationship or that, I think, clarity in conversation with the rabbi. And so we said, go talk to the rabbi. We also don't know a lot about the rabbi in question. And like, you know, there's some there too that we could pull on. You know, I think what you'll see or what you'll hear in Bintel Brief episodes is that we ask as many questions as we answer. Like it's important, like we are digging in and probing and asking questions. And there was a lot of information with Sex Party Rabbi and with every question in between where we could have had many more details and like gotten so much more information and perhaps changed what we said. But I don't think it would have changed the fact that this person needed to go talk to their rabbi.
Right. But we definitely didn't say, okay, you got to go tattle to the board or like, you know, there were definitely things that we clearly ruled out. Like it was not, that didn't feel right to us. Or like leaving the congregation or like those things didn't feel right to us. We thought at least a first step should be just to kind of come clean and be like, Rabbi, help me, talk me through this.
Excellent. I really like that. That's like a really great response and a good kind of script for how to approach that. So the last question I have for all of you is, how has doing the podcast or looking through the archives changed how you relate to your Jewish identity?
I think it's actually made me a little more humble, or just humble is a word that leapt to mind because I used to write, my husband is a rabbi. He was a congregational rabbi for a long time. And I used to write a column for Tablet called The Rabbi's Wife, where I would, write about just personal stuff that came up through the lens of whatever. But it was personal. And I tried to make it broadly relevant to readers, but it started with my own experience, not just about being the rabbi's wife, because that's not that interesting in and of itself. And so just comparing that to this, obviously we bring our own lenses, lives, and experiences to how we think about our answers. But there is something much more humbling for me, making the transition to writing from a, pretty informed and immersed perspective in one current of Jewish life in America to speaking, I'm not going to say speaking for anybody, but having just a bigger soapbox where it doesn't start with me. It might start with me, but it certainly doesn't end with me. And having the honor of drawing on, of taking this, part of this role and working with this group of people to create what we do has certainly deepens my thinking about my role in like history, but not in a grandiose way, in the opposite. In just it comes with a lot of humility for me.
I think humility is a really on point word for describing this. And I think, Lynn mentioned being married to a congregational rabbi or someone who was a congregational rabbi for a little while. And so she's had an experience of being kind of a public Jew for a longer period of time. I would say my public Jewishness became a thing when I took a role at Ben the Arc Jewish Action a few years ago. And so for me, I've been evolving into this public Jewishness. And so I'm still figuring out what that means for me to live my Jewish life publicly and what it means for my own experience to perhaps be open to critique or to challenge or what have you. And so is my own experience applicable enough, authentic enough, representative enough to be in this role? So going back to that humility piece, the listeners can't see my husband crawling behind me on the floor. Like, did not realize the wide angle of the camera.
BBC
That's
reporter.
Your husband? I thought that was a kid.
Right? No, that's my husband. You might as well stand up now, sweetie.
It's just a podcast. There's no video. It's fine.
Judy? Photobomb.
I was like, does she know that we know?
I didn't, and then I just welcome to my world.
Just for listeners to like fully explain what just happened, because I think I'm going to keep this in. This is hilarious. Gina's husband was crawling behind her, And I just saw like a head and part of a body, which I assumed was a little body, like a child's. And it was not. It was a whole adult person.
It was a whole adult person.
A whole adult person.
Yeah.
Bless his heart, as we say.
I guess for me, like now I feel compelled. I have to say something about humility, but actually,
no, go bravado. Go bravado.
Yeah.
No, because it's completely humbling to be the archivist of this, organization, this paper, this historical document, this vast historical document is obviously very, very humbling, and it's an honor. But there's no question that when the archival material is released, like the release of the Bintels to the public on the podcast or, on our site too, Ginna and Lynn also write on the site. And it's really, really, that always changes me, I think, to see what happens once it's released to the public, once it goes into the ether. Like what happens, right? My understanding of history, my understanding of myself as a Jew changes, right? So that's kind of the gift of it being a newspaper-based history, and also that it contains the voices. Like even when we're doing Sex Party Bintel, which is a very, very right contemporary voice, obviously. But the Walt Whitman phrase that our publisher actually reused recently is that the forward contains multitudes. And I think that's kind of the gift that is available to anybody if you read us, if you engage with us. Obviously, if you listen to the podcast, it deepens, I think, it deepens my idea of myself as an individual, but obviously, that individual is a Jew. So
I do think also, love, that Chana is our biggest fan, like without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Like for sure.
And our biggest asset.
And our biggest asset.
And the crazy thing was she was able to concentrate that entire time while Gina's husband was also crawling behind Chana, which is just so weird. Also, Sex Party Bintel is definitely the name for the next gala. I'm just saying.
What a great name. I love that. Okay, this has been amazing, but let's also wrap up with key information for listeners. So the forward is 125, new website, A Bintel Brief Season 2, which is coming out now, because you had your first episode last week, and it's coming out weekly now for the next 10 weeks?
Every other week. So we'll have 10 episodes every other week, and we dropped at the end of April. So you can do the math.
So listeners, definitely tune in. I've learned a lot on this podcast, and I'm sure, and from listening to A Bintel Brief, and I think everyone will enjoy it and keep enjoying it. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, this one, and for the work that you do. And
thank you. Also, Lev is single.
Yes.
Thank you. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news, stories, or reports referenced for this episode.